a little bit to talk a little bit today about using stories to create emotional connections in learning. And so in order to do that, first I want to tell you a story about an educational experience that I've had myself. This is a photo of my elementary school where I went when I was a kid. That's when I was about 10 years old. It looked a lot like that. This is a fairly recent photo. It didn't look all that different when I was there years ago. And one of the projects that we did when I was in 5th grade and 10 years old was we had to learn about state governments. And the way that traditionally you would learn about state governments in the US is memorize a bunch of facts, take some tests, see how you do, and that's about it. And instead, we had a very, very different approach. We were asked to choose a state that we were interested in and put together, basically the goal was put together a scrapbook showing key facts about the state and key sort of, elements relating to the state. Okay, so the goal was to put something together that looked something like this. I chose the state of Pennsylvania, which is where I was born. So I live in New York. I grew up a little bit in the Washington, D.C. area. My family had been from New York. Pennsylvania was where I was born. I was there for 1 year. So to me, it was interesting. This school was in the Washington, D.C. area. Pennsylvania was interesting to me personally because I didn't know that much about it. I lived there for 1 year. It's the first year of my life. So anyway, the goal was to put this together. So the scrapbook looks something like this. I have long been obsessed with trying to find the actual scrapbook, which I'm convinced still exists in my parents' garage, but have not yet succeeded. The way we went about this was by working with our teacher as kind of an advisor. So she would work with us individually, maybe make some suggestions, but she really would go out and do the research. It wasn't just, looking stuff up on Google, and this was before there was Google, or just going to the library. It was, thinking of creative ways to solve the problem. So we might, for example, one thing we did was write letters to the state government entities and see if they could give us some information. And that's where some of these kinds of things like the state seal and the state bird and all that kind of stuff came from. We would talk a lot with our friends. It was very much a collaborative culture, and we would talk a lot with our friends about our projects, and they were really, really, personally interesting. So, the culture was, if I found out like, hey, there's something called the Chamber of Commerce, and they're really helpful to me, then my friend might say, yeah, that's great, I'll try it out. You were not trying to compete, you were trying to collaborate. And so you would meet with your teacher periodically, you'd meet with it, as a group, and it was a really successful, memorable project. Here it is, years later, I still remember it and look at it as a great educational experience. So logistics were helpful. There was one teacher and only 15 students. We did have budget to do things like pay for long distance calls, which actually cost a lot of money at the time, things like that. And we're very much encouraged to talk with each other about the projects. So why is this so memorable? So, this is so much more memorable and was also very effective. First of all, because I had a strong emotional connection to the project. And this began in the beginning. I was sort of creating my own story in a certain sense, right? Like this was a personal project. I got to pick Pennsylvania where I was born, and I didn't know a lot about it. That made it interesting, to me, no offense to other US states, but there are a handful that have personal relevance. And by just getting to pick one that had, really carried things a long way. So there's a lot more about that. I have a really strong emotional connection to the project. So where else do stories come in? So another role for stories in education is existing stories, right? So this was, my little story here was about creating something. It was very much a creation project. But stories in general can be really, really memorable, even if other people are telling them. Sometimes, especially if other people are telling them and you're not experiencing them in the moment. It can be applied well to other problems. You hear somebody's example, you will face a similar situation. And so one of the goals then is to figure out how you can abstract away from that situation. And again, they can be interesting, inspiring, and create emotional connections. And that's a lot of why stories in learning experiences work really, really well. Or they certainly can work really well. What we're going to do with a little bit of the time that we have is show you a couple of examples. So first, I want to show an example from a legal education course that I was involved in. So this is a course called Communicating with Pro Bono Clients. And it's a course for an audience of attorneys who are learning to do pro bono work for mostly for low-income clients. So the idea is a lot of the audience is made up of people who work for big law firms, and they generally work sort of, under a lot of pressure, get paid a lot of money, work with kind of, big expensive clients, and there's a whole way that relationship works out. This is for the times when they're going to do pro bono work, where they're going to help somebody who doesn't have, the ability to afford this kind of, lawyer, and they're going to help out. There are a lot of things that are very, very different about that kind of interaction. The power dynamic, the kinds of experiences that people have, it's just a very different audience. And so a lot of the course is about helping them learn how to work with that group. Some of it is also for people who are legal aid attorneys and work with these people all the time. This was a course that was created for a continuing legal education company called the Practicing Law Institute, which is the biggest legal education company in the US. And so their clients are all lawyers and people who work mostly at big law firms. So that's who this is for. So there's a lot of work involved in trying to put people in the right situations to understand and work well with these clients. So this was a course that involved a lot of different parts, different kinds of activities, some scenarios that I'll actually show you a little bit of in a minute. But it also had a video instructor. So it had an instructor. It's a self-paced course primarily. Certainly in one form, it's totally self-paced. And the instructor is pre-recorded in video. But she's done this job. She has been there. She is a legal aid attorney who has worked with, big firm attorneys as well, and worked with a lot of clients with similar backgrounds to those that they're talking about in this course. So she has a lot of experience to draw on. So the course looks something like this. At the beginning, she introduces things and tells you a little bit about some characters, which I'll talk a little bit more about in just a minute. But then at one point, she also starts to tell some of her own personal stories. So I'm going to show you one of those in just a second. So I'm going to switch over to show a video, and we're going to show her name is Alicia Aiken, and she goes by Lish. And I'm going to show you part of one of Lish's stories, just to give you a feel for the kinds of stories that she tells successfully in this course.
Let's spend some time thinking about how we create, build, and sustain the attorney-client relationship.
All right, I'm going to jump ahead so she gets to a concrete story.
You have the privilege to offer help.
We'll get there in just about 3 seconds.
Make the small changes to make clients comfortable. Experiences with legal systems in cultures outside the US can influence client expectations about the American legal system. I'll never forget the client who asked, "When do we bribe the judge?" She was a refugee from a country with a corrupt legal system. In her country, you could not win any case without paying for it. And she was nervous that we weren't planning for that. We couldn't ignore her concerns. In order to strengthen our attorney-client relationship and her trust, we had to have explicit discussions about how we do not bribe the judges in this system. You may ask, what do hidden court rules have to do with attorney-client relationships? Here are 3 specific connections. First, when you take time to consider the hidden rules for clients, you put yourself in their shoes and build your capacity to empathize with them about the experience of participating in court proceedings.
Okay, I'm going to switch back away from that. She talks a little bit more, and it's an interesting story. But one of the things that's most notable about that is that she tells, she tells a compelling story. So, she kind of has you from, wait, they wanted to bribe the judge. She has your attention. It's a real thing that happened to her. It's a real thing that could happen to the audience of this course. And she then goes beyond that and starts to talk about, what are your takeaways? What do you do with that? So she doesn't just leave you with the story thinking, well, that's great. If I ever run into anyone wanting to do that, that's, I'll know I'm not the only one. But, she gets into a little bit about why she's telling the story, which is, there are sort of quote unquote hidden rules behind the scenes that you have to understand when you're working with a client. So that's one use of stories, I think, that was always kind of interesting. So, why did this work? Well, probably because it's real and specific. She is, more than credible. She's really done this. She's done this. By the time you even see this in the course, you've had a few minutes with her already, and she's, you've seen her background, and you know that this is someone that you believe, and it's a real story, and it's very specific. She's telling you about a particular case. So she's not just stating principles, she's telling a particular case and making it clear. And it's memorable. She picked one, there are other stories she could have told. She told the one that's going to grab people's attention, that makes the point. And that's a challenge when you're picking the right story, right? It needs to make the point, but you also want it to, if you have something that's memorable and makes the point and really grabs people, that's great. She also was clear and concise. That was pretty quick. She went on for a little bit longer. I did cut off the clip, but the story itself was not longer than necessary. Right? It's not just telling the facts about what happened, because that would really kind of not feel like a story and wouldn't be interesting to people. But it was clear, and it was at the right level of detail, and was done pretty quickly. And then she highlighted the key points to take away. Right. So what am I getting out of this? What am I, as the audience, knowing who the audience, she knows who the audience is for that story. What am I getting out of it? Another use that we've had in some of the course that we've done is stories from non-experts. In other words, experiences that people have had. So here's another quick example, which is from a course for leasing professionals, people who rent out apartments. So this is people who are working in or starting to work in the leasing profession, where their job is going to rent out apartments. And the goal is to give them all the skills that they need. And part of what they need to understand is what prospective people come in when they're looking for an apartment. So one of the things that our team did on this course was go out and work, do a bunch of basically talk to a bunch of people who are looking for apartments and video their stories. So there's a little bit more to it than that, but that's basically what this is. So I'll show you just a little bit of some of the stories that we have here, and then we'll just give you another example.
The way I go about looking for an apartment, first of all, especially it's a location, obviously, price.
I'm going to jump ahead to a specific story.
Whether the bus stations, how easy it is to get to the apartment, like all those are like really deciding factors when I look for a place. When I decide where I want to move, the number one factor is the people, and I think the second factor is the quality of the apartment.
Washer and dryer in the unit. I think it's very important. Yeah, man, I hate sharing laundry with other people, and like there's hours that you can't do laundry. That's annoying.
The things that I liked about the renting process is when the leasing agent really gets excited.
I always appreciate it when the leasing agent talks straight to me and my partner instead of just to the guy, because sometimes if you're just talking to the guy, then I'm kind of like, well, I'm right here, what are you doing?
I was looking for an apartment in Hoboken, right? Second or third floor, I don't know, I take an elevator, and there was some like reception person. They were just super attentive, and they showed me around.
And she
Okay, so that gives you a little bit of a feel for some of those. So some of those were, a little bit, especially the guy talking about the person in the elevator, was very, very much a specific story of something that happened to him, and the others were a little bit more, drawn from their cases, drawn from the specific stories. So, key points that they've taken away. But again, those are a little bit memorable, and you get, their real feel, they're real people. If you're the audience for the course, which is the leasing professionals, getting to know people's real personal stories gives you a lot of insight that's gonna help. And again, these were sincere and believable people, and the audience can relate to those situations. I think if you're a leasing professional, you've probably heard these, and if you've looked for apartments, you can certainly relate to that as well. Talk a little bit more about storyline. So storyline, in the context that I kind of want to use it, is an ongoing narrative. So it's more than just a single story. We see that in TV, we see that in movies, we see an ongoing storyline, especially in a TV show week to week. So in the communicating with pro bono clients course that we saw a little bit of before, we saw Lish the lawyer. We also follow and discuss the interactions between Ray, an attorney, and Jane, his client, throughout most of the course. So storylines can allow also learner control, as in online simulations. But let's take a little bit of a look at Ray and Jane, and this will, I think, be the last video that we've got time for. I'll show you one more. Ray and Jane are also just kind of fun to see and talk with. So I'm going to show a little bit about Ray and Jane. This is their first meeting. Ray is the lawyer, Jane is his client.
Again, Ms. Wilson, I'm Ray Richardson, and I'm the attorney who'll be looking into your case for you.
Thanks so much for seeing me. I'm just so torn up about this. I've barely slept since I got the letter. I took a sleeping pill, but that didn't help.
I'm here to help you, Ms. Wilson. Now, let's start by being clear about what we're doing. Okay, legal aid has asked me to take on your case, and I've agreed to do the work on your divorce for you. Now, we have about an hour, and my job during our time today is to understand what happened, answer any questions you may have, and to put together our to-do list for the next meeting. Now, in order to help me do that, I need to understand what you're dealing with. So, can you tell me exactly what happened?
Well, I got this letter, an official document from the court, saying that my husband was divorcing me. I mean, he moved out 3 months ago, but this letter was so final, you know? And I didn't know it was coming. We haven't talked much.
Ray and Jane are fun and dramatic, and you know, show you a lot more. But they're throughout. They are there throughout the course. You see a lot of Ray and Jane in this course, but it's not just Ray and Jane as it's not just there for the drama. Like, this is a real interaction that's based on real things that have happened, and it's a story based on even a set of real stories that have happened to other people. And through this storyline is used throughout the course as part of different activities. So in one, for example, you follow what Ray and Jane has done. You have to analyze whether it was done well or whether it wasn't done well. Similar activities where you might decide what Ray should do next in a certain situation. Lish, the attorney, will often use this as a story she can tell. Well, when Ray did this, she'll cite examples. So a lot of uses in this, and here's how it looked in the course. Okay. So storyline, as we said, is an ongoing narrative. And we followed and discussed Ray and Jane throughout most of the course. A lot of advantages. You get learner engagement, which can extend outside the course. I've actually met people who talk about Ray and Jane to this day, even though they took the course a long time ago, and that you think that wouldn't possibly be possible, but it kind of had enough TV show elements, I think, that people really enjoyed it. But these were real. This was not just for entertainment at all. It was very much not just for entertainment. It was for learning purposes, and these were really concrete, in-depth experiential examples. So you weren't just looking at abstract concepts like, oh, make sure you ask questions to get the details of the case. Like, in a real situation, you have to ask questions in a complicated situation. She was having a tough time dealing with this. You have to be empathetic. You should be human. As a lawyer, you don't want to just drill her with a bunch of questions. That is a mistake that we were told a lot of lawyers tend to make in that case, is, kind of not account for the fact that Jane is really, this is hard. She's going through something difficult and unexpected. And, some lawyers will tend to focus too much on, like, okay, well, just tell me the story. I want to know what happened, day 1, day 2, day 3, when did each of these things happen? And that's going to be very hard on her, but also not going to form a good relationship or really, sometimes people just shut down. And storylines can also be used to enrich class discussions. There was a version of this course that was not self-paced, was also run kind of as a MOOC model, where there were also online discussions about the scenes and what could have happened. And so lawyers would debate with each other, as well as talking with the subject matter expert through discussion forums about what could have gone differently. So the storylines were great, and having Ray and Jane be characters you get to know gives you a level of depth. So this course takes a few hours to complete overall, something people don't necessarily do in one sitting. But watching the same characters through a number of scenes and getting to know their situation and being able to refer to things that had happened to them that are appropriately memorable is really, really useful. Okay, so I'm going to skip the activity with Ray and Jane I told you a little bit about. Learner-controlled storylines. Simulation-based approaches to learning are often great. A lot of my own early work was in simulations that often focus on storylines that learners can control. So you would have an interaction and decide what happens next based on a series of choices, or sometimes a little bit better than that. All right, so here's an example of another course. We don't have time for the full demo, but this is an attorney who you are working with. You can tell my legal client lets me show everything. An attorney you're working with, who are trying to sell her work, and you have a lunch meeting with her, and you get to decide how this plays out. And after that, you make a lot of decisions as the conversation unfolds about what to say next. And depending on how you do, she reacts differently. So you might press her too much and she kind of shuts down and says she has to go. You might ask appropriate open-ended questions and she'll have some good things to say. So a lot of different ways that we can go there. Other key points I want to make before I kind of wrap up and open the floor for questions. Role of stories in education: context matters tremendously. We saw that with Lish's example, that it was in context, and she really set up the story. The setup and the follow-up are absolutely crucial. And the overall experience design should help people make appropriate abstractions and see how to apply the story. When you're designing activities around stories, there are a bunch of different ways to do it. Stories within the simulation after a mistake are often really helpful. And I don't have an example of everything to show, but that's one that we've done a lot of, where you might alienate the lawyer and you're trying to sell work to her and she leaves, and you might get a story at that time from someone who comes up and says, hey, you know what? I once had a meeting where, I had a similar situation. Here's how I handled it, and here's how it went well. Or here's how I handled it, and here's why it didn't go well, but what I would have done differently. Cognitively at that point, you're just in the right moment to learn and for it to feel relevant. Creating your own story. Social media is great. People can make their own videos. People can post things and discuss them. Tell your own stories. Different industries have different, constraints on what you're kind of comfortable telling. Analysis, discussion, debate. What would you have done differently as the storyteller or as the educator? So there are a lot of different things that you can do in those kinds of situations. Okay. So I'm going to jump just ahead to kind of one more point I want to get to. Kind of covered most of these things. Technology really makes this easier, right? Video story creation has never been easier, and you can tell stories to people from far away, as I am today with you, right? This wasn't always the case. When I was in 5th grade, we had our nice little group of 15 people, but we didn't really have ways to, communicate other than telephone. Outside of that group that was in the class together, we're physically there. We can build a lot of online activities, building on the learning from stories, creating the right situation for people to learn from stories, and use the stories to help people become more and more engaged. Social media can play a significant role, and mobile devices certainly make access to stories and the creation of stories easier than ever. So much more. So a few final thoughts. Stories to me contribute tremendously to learning, and especially in professional education are very, very relevant. You can tell something interesting and people will really get it. There's a lot of professional education that still relies on reciting principles and expecting people to know when and how to apply them, and you don't really get enough enough of an authentic activity in the educational literature, enough situated cognition. None of that is really, it's not really what you're doing when you get those principles. You don't know where to apply them. They're usually things you will not disagree with, but you won't know how to apply them. And you won't really understand them at a deep enough level, without seeing and participating in examples. So telling stories is one way. Participating in your own stories is obviously fantastic. And combining the two works really nicely. Creating the ideal types of stories and activities around them can really give us effective, engaging learning that connect with its audience. And that's kind of why I've looked at stories and storytelling as a big part of what I've always found interesting and relevant, and why I want to focus on it today. So I don't have a tremendous amount of time, so I want to thank you for your time here, and we've got some time for questions, comments, and everything else, and hope you've enjoyed what we've seen, and enjoyed seeing Ray and Jane and some of the other demos a little bit, as well as some examples. So thanks for spending the time with me through this presentation, and I'm happy to talk about anything else you'd like over the time we have left.
Great. Thank you, David, for your nice presentation. I really enjoyed it. And so we are open to the questions. If anyone online or in the room have any questions, if not, I'll have some questions for you after that. Vivian, that's a clap. There's a cloud.
There's a clap.
Peter, yes. So
yes.
Peter, go ahead.
Thank you so much for your talk. I hope you guys can hear me.
Yes.
Yeah. I also have a bit of a cold, so I sound a bit weird. I'm sorry for that. Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. I think it's a really interesting approach to use storytelling in your courses. But what I am wondering still a little bit is how this kind of fits into a broader theoretical framework. So I think maybe the question is kind of twofold, like what kind of behavior do you try to target in students? And how do you then interpret that behavior from like a theoretical perspective? So how do you explain the changes you will see through like storytelling?
No, that's a great question. I don't. I think it probably has a longer answer than I can fully give. Let me give you a little bit of background. So, in terms of what behaviors to change, I mean, one thing about the kind of work that I'm involved in, and especially in with the company part, is that it's really just across the board, right? So every course is changing different behavior, right? Every course begins with a lot of discussions about what behaviors do you want to change, and actually, particularly in the the workplace world, that's not always how education's thought of, right? So they often, a client will often come in with like, here are the things we want to teach, and we're getting to, well, what do you want people to be able to do? Which is exactly, you've hit on exactly the right question. It's not always the question that's asked. So there's always a lot of effort to simply get to what are the behavior changes that you want to bring about. And so then we have a process that gets to specifics, right? So it gets to specifics about what are the behaviors you want to change, what are the misconceptions that people have, what are mistakes that people make, and try to understand all those and put together some kind of content theory of the, basically the subject, and then design activities around that. So it's a mix of science and creativity, I think, in that way, in terms of process. Finding the right places for the stories is also, I don't think I could tell you there's an algorithm that says a story goes here, but I can tell you there are principles that can help. And it's driven also by what good stories do you have, right? So sometimes you have a good story and you want to build something around it. Sometimes you have, this is a critical point and we want to make sure we have examples. Couple of things that we lean on heavily from the education literature are the notion of situated cognition, that people learn best in context, and authentic activities, the idea that you really want the activities they experience to be real. And so there's a lot from John Seeley Brown and Alan Collins, who actually worked with us in the early days, and again, Paul DeGuide on those, which we've leaned on. So, there is always, I think, a balance when you're doing something at this kind of balancing the theoretical and the practical, and sort of always in terms of what you can produce, in terms of what you can produce in the time that you have or the access you have. So there is a sort of a base, I guess I'd say that, so there are base principles behind it and a process to follow to try to get the most out of it. Does that answer at least some of your question and give you a little bit of feel for how this does and can work? I think it's a little different than teaching, it's a little different maybe than some of the university experiences in that way.
No, this answers a great deal of my question. Thank you.
Thank you. No, that's a great question. I think I think the real answer is about a semester long, but I think it's a fantastic question.
Good.
I have a question.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Thanks a lot, David, for your interesting talk. And I'm Xiaoling. I'm doing research about assessment in higher education, and so my question will also be related to assessment. So I didn't hear descriptions or statements about how you assess, or is it necessary to do the assessment there, or because I would imagine that it would be really hard to quantify the performance and how you evaluate the performance there. So what's your take there? What's your opinion there?
Yeah, no, that's a quick question. Yeah, no, I'm happy to speak to all those a little bit. So yeah, I did focus on experience rather than assessment. And yeah, assessment is a challenge, especially in the sort of, workplace business world, where they're accustomed to, people take a test and, you get the answers, but that doesn't tell you whether they're going to really be good at changing behavior. What we try to do when we can is at least include performance-based assessments as part of a course we build, right? So if, if the course is about how to, have the right conversations with people who are looking to rent apartments, then ideally the assessment is similar to that, right? So, you're put in positions where you have to have conversations and you have to perform well. So we try to make them performance-based as much as possible. Evaluating people when they're out, when a course is out and out in the field and working has always been really, really hard for two reasons. One is, from a budget standpoint, it's been a really big battle to get most of the clients to work with to really sort of invest in something more substantial. The other is that sometimes it's hard to know what the cause is of better performance, right? So ideally you would measure performance out in the field, right? So somebody, people take this course, you would measure them and compare them to, how well did they do versus how well did people who didn't take the course do? And that's usually hard to get people to actually do. And usually hard to even, fully control for what effectiveness course was, there was something I worked on way back, I mean, way back in the 90s, which was for a phone company in the US, and it was to help the people who looked up phone listings. This is back when you called to get a phone number for someone. And it taught them a very specific process. They had a specialized computer system, and it taught them how to look up the listings efficiently. And it was actually sort of like complicated. And what we were able to do with that was actually have a real control group and say, okay, here are the people who took the course. Then they go out and they take real phone calls. They were this fast and this accurate. The goals of the training were to be fast and accurate. I give that example a lot because it was 30 years ago, and it's like I've never been able to equal it because nobody has quite been able to do that. So there were a lot of factors that let us, be that clear on how effective things were. So anyway, so I've kind of answered a little bit about assessing people's success in terms of learning the right skills, and then a little bit about assessing the effectiveness of the course itself. And so hopefully that's giving you a little bit of insight. And I know neither of these are 100%. This is how it always works, because nothing is ever the same in my world.
Yeah, indeed. I understand what you're talking about, and that's indeed the case. I was just wondering how you deal with that, because it's never easy to make this comparison, even if it is the person themselves. It would be hard for them also to say what exactly I have changed, and what exactly, if I have changed, how the other viewed me or look at me. So yeah. That's exactly.
Yeah, no, and sometimes there are different areas that are more useful metrics that we might be able to get, right? Like the directory assistance one, which isn't a job that exists anymore, was so nice because you had, speed and accuracy were the things, and those were quantitative, right? Like you could evaluate those, and there was very little about that job that mattered other than being fast and accurate, right? Like, yes, you have to be friendly, but those are short conversations. It wasn't that big a deal, So almost all the job we could really evaluate. We've done a lot in the business world with customer service training, and there it's a little bit easier to sometimes get evaluations, but harder to pinpoint, what the reason for the change is, right? So are they also, because sometimes when there's a big customer service training initiative, it's also because there's a big customer service process change also going on. There's a big initiative and we're part of it. But there's a little bit more, I think, we sometimes able to do there, right? Like, okay, here's what customers thought. Customer satisfaction scores went up. There are things like that are, that you can do either at the generic level or even at the specific person level. But it's inconsistent at best. Absolutely.
Thanks a lot.
Good. So Vivian, you want to go in?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, perfect. Hi, my name is Vivian. I'm from Leiden University. I'm a PhD also at CEL. And I was wondering, maybe I had missed this in the beginning, but I was wondering, what is your definition of a story? Because from what I've been following from the presentation, I saw explanations, examples, anecdotes, conversations, and actual stories. So I was wondering, what is your definition there?
Yeah, no, to me, story is in sort of the broad sense of story, that sometimes it can be anything from a specific, example that someone gives, a specific story of something that's happened to them, to something that's constructed a little bit more as a, as a group. I think all of those count for the purposes of this talk, and for, for learning purposes as useful types of stories. So I do like it in the broad context. That's also why I brought storyline into it, is the idea that that's kind of an extended version. There's not really a specific story in, the overall use of Ray and Jane in the legal course, but following that storyline, which has a lot of different components, gets us a lot of the a lot of the advantages of stories. So no, I think that's a really interesting question. I think there are definitely, tighter and broader definitions, and probably advantage to each, but that's a really good question.
Have you experimented before with the different types of stories in your courses, and how that works in education?
Experimented in the sense of trying different things. Yes, experimented in being able to have, formal experiments. I'd love to, and that's always where we kind of get, run out of somebody who wants to fund that kind of thing. So a few of the contexts that I mentioned a little bit briefly at the end definitely work. Like, so you saw, one place where stories have worked really well is when you have a known expert as we did with Lish the lawyer, right? So she's telling stories that really resonate with people because they already know she's already credible, right? And so there's that. Another thing that works, sort of another relevant factor, is being in the right context. So with Lish, she's more the instructor of the course, and then she's driving the course, so she kind of tells the story when it's appropriate. In a simulation course where you're learning a lot more by doing, there's a great opportunity, I mentioned sort of briefly, for stories just in time. So, even in something simple like customer service, we actually use this a lot. So, you make a mistake, you anger the customer, and you have somebody come up from the, who can tell you a story, who's an experienced person from the retail company you're working for, who says, look, I had the situation once where the person came in a little bit angry, and, my temptation was to kind of just give them the facts, but by giving them the facts, it just angered them more because they needed something more emotional. Here's what I did. So that's another situation where you get a different kind of story. So we've experimented with those in a lot of different ways, and yeah, I mean, experimented, I guess, for kind of 30 years now. So tried them in a lot of different contexts, and a lot of different situations have worked. And there are a lot of factors that can make a story work, including the context that it's in. So those are two examples. I think one of the reasons that I chose to show the apartment seekers was to show a different type of story that's not from an expert, right? That's from a story of somebody who's, not an expert at all, but it's a story from your audience. And it's a story that, in that sense, you're getting something different out of the stories. You're getting insights that you might not fully get. Like you might get insights about yourself, because sometimes a lot of times the audience for that course is people who have a little bit of experience. They're not totally brand new. So you may see yourself in some of those, right? You may see someone say, hey, well, some of those are mostly the good ones, but some of them are like, oh, once someone, they greeted me, but then they kind of just left me hanging there. They disappeared. They didn't come back for 10 minutes. I didn't know what happened. And, and I just left, and there was no way I was going to rent from them. And that's a real story that I heard, I know we heard somewhere in there. And you hear that as a leasing person, you may think like, I think I may have done that, and it resonates a little bit differently. So those are just a few different examples, but yeah, there are lots of different ways, I think, to use stories, and with the ability of people to create their own over the last, especially decade or so, as everybody can build their own stories. There's a whole world, I think, of different approaches in terms of stories and story sharing and storytelling as well, especially across people who are working in similar areas, whether it's more of a conference model or a workplace model at sort of all levels.
Good. Yeah, thank you. Just for the last question, if no one else have any question, because my background is clinical psychology, so I always wonder, and I always see emotions and also storytelling as a two-sided sword. So maybe also they can not only create some positive emotions or positive side effects for the learning, but also I'm thinking that maybe in some situation they can cause some negative effects and negative experiences. So in your research or in your work, have you ever experienced a situation which this stories cause negative effects on the learning?
It's a good question. It's something to be aware of. I'm not aware of any cases where it caused negative effects on learning. I know actually a story from somebody else's story. It's a little bit more than a story example, but it kind of worked. Somebody else I know did a VR course for a major bank in the US about how to handle robbery situations. And so this wasn't exactly a story example, but it was a very emotional example. And it was a pretty realistic experience. Like I saw a little bit of this, like, it kind of comes out of nowhere. They don't really warn you that you're going to get robbed, which is, I think, the absolute right way to do it. It's realistic. It's kind of, purports to be about something else. You're kind of, working as a bank teller in this VR simulation, going about your business. And then, and it's a pretty threatening situation. And they actually found that some of the people who took the course found it uncomfortable, to the degree that they didn't really feel good that they had taken the course. And that was probably the first time I did something that strong about a negative reaction, right? That and so where's the line in terms of that? In terms of someone else's story, I'm sure there are. I think we just haven't heard. I'm sure, and I don't know about in terms of the learning, but I'm sure people have had negative reactions. They may well have had negative reactions that turned out to be good. I'm sure people have watched some of the leasing people and said, and thought, oh my God, I've done this, and maybe been kind of pissed off that they had to think about that, but in the end it was better. So there are a whole, I mean, I'm sure there's been a range of emotions, and I think it's a really interesting area, and probably, you know, one for continued further exploration. And yeah, it's absolutely a lot of different ways to go and interesting. So fortunately, I haven't been aware of any cases where we felt that the stories themselves were, you know, distracting or caused, you know, anything negative in the learning necessarily itself. But I will absolutely, I'm sure that there are stories that people have had some, you know, visceral reaction for one reason or another that they didn't like. I mean, sometimes they don't like the person. You know, I mean, there's that too, right? I mean, you can see something. I mean, it's going to happen. Sometimes they won't like the person. They just remind me of, you know, somebody who broke up with me. I don't know. There are all these things are going to happen, and you can't, you know, account for them all.
Yeah, sure. Great. Thank you for your talk again. We all really enjoy it, and I think it's a good initiative to have a future collaboration between our institute and your organizations in New York. And if no one have any other question, then we can wrap up and finish the session. Any other question? No? No? Yes? No? Okay. Good. Thank you again. We wish you a great day or night. I don't know. What is the time in here?
Yeah, still, yeah, I'm earlier here, so still morning here. So
Okay.
just getting going on the workday. So yes.
Excellent. Okay, so
All right.
thank you, Enid. And thank you all for joining us today. And see you next time. Goodbye.
All right. Thanks, everybody. All right. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. See you later.
Thank you. See you. Please feel free to stay in touch. Thanks again, everybody.